You're listening to the Rural Press Club of Queensland's Lunch Series podcast.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Neville and I have the privilege of working for LNP Leader of the Opposition, Deb Fredlington, and I'm also the Vice President of the Rural Press Club here today. And I've got the privilege of introducing the Speaker, Matt Evans. Some of you may notice I'm wearing this flashy tie, and it's no coincidence that I'm wearing this green and gold pig tie, because it has a crossover with today's Speaker on National Agriculture Day. See, Matthew Evans is probably most famous for his SBS television program Gourmet Farmer, hosted on his smallhold Tasmanian property, and it's quite tastefully named Fat Pig Farm. So I deliberately wore this tie. So the success of his show has been quite well talked about. It's on its 5th season, and it traces the journey of Matthew and his partner Sadie's journey of leaving the big smoke in Melbourne to create a sustainable and ethical farm in rural Tasmania. But you're probably like, hold up, what's so special about some scene changer from the city becoming a blockie and trying their hand in Tassie? Well, the story behind Matthew has got the story behind how Matthew got there is quite a journey, and the choices he's made is quite exceptional. And to be honest, not everyone has a camera crew following them around, so that's also quite helpful. See, Matthew was a chef, a food critic, and his views on the relationship between agriculture and consumers is quite interesting. He has some different views around what your conventional farmer might have. He also understands consumers and what they want. You could almost say Matthew's success has been brought about by his ability to tell agriculture's story to an increasingly metropolitan Australia with a sensitivity and nuance few others have been able to bring. Add to the fact that Matt is quite the provoker of ideas. He's written 10 books ranging from topics around valuing and questioning animal welfare issues in meat production to putting a microscope on veganism and its rationale. He's surely said a thing or two that has challenged everyone's views in this room today. But that's what the Rural Press Club is about, challenging ideas around how we perceive and engage in agriculture. By doing this, we only better our great industry, which benefits all Australians. It's also what National Agriculture Day is all about, celebrating the components of our great industry and its varied incarnations. I'm sure too that Matthew has some things to say that will also pose some questions to everyone in the room today. So I'm expecting to see a flurry of hands. So, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to welcome Matthew Evans to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. I know you guys have had a lot of fires nearby and a lot of sort of harsh conditions, so I know a lot of people would have. It would be an extra burden to make it in if you've come in from regional areas that are sort of suffering. So if you've come in from regional areas in particular, thank you. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my story and how I got to where I am, and then maybe talk about how I see farming, because often I get to talk to groups that aren't very farmery, occasionally gardening groups, but generally most of the public. So I thought I'd do something that's a bit more farmery, if that's a word, today. So, and that's a bit of a new thing for me. So I might stumble along the way, and I've had to take more notes than I normally would. But I wanted to really briefly, I'll tell you about what we do, and then how I got there, and then give us some of my views. So I run a small farm in southern Tasmania. It's 70 acres, so it's a mixed farm. We have pigs, goats. I milk 2 or 3 dairy cows, depending on the season. Between 1 and 3 dairy cows, depending on the season. We have a market garden, 2 acres of market garden, a kilometre worth of garden beds. We have pigs. Probably said that already. We've got a heritage orchard. So where I live, the Huon Valley, which is an hour south of Hobart, was all orchards. Pretty much every bit of open country was orchards until the late 60s, early 70s, and a combination of bushfire and loss of favourable trading terms with the with Britain, and when they joined the European Community, the Common Market, as I think it was called, meant that they grubbed out all the apple trees. So what we do on our little farm is we grow food. We grow it for us to eat, but we grow it to serve at a little restaurant. We have a 35. Well, if you're from the council, it's a 35-seat restaurant, and if you're taking the bookings, it's 45. And we grow 90 to 95% of what we serve at our little restaurant is from the farm. So we generally open Fridays for lunch. That's it. Sometimes we open twice a week, and everything. And we have no machinery on the farm. So that's the little setup that we've got at the moment. That's what we've come to. So I'm a chef by trade, chosen to grow food by desire, and now get to combine those two things on the farm. But I want to tell you a little bit about how I got there. So I'm going to start a long way back, and that's that. Well, I was born in a mining town, a coal mining town in South Wales, in the UK. And I was born in this town. The pit's now closed, but I was born to on my father's side, they were miners, coal miners going way back, a long way back. My grandfather's grandfather or great-grandfather was actually trapped in a pit in North Wales in 1819. The pit flooded. There were 19 people. And they started to pull them out. He was 100 metres down. They started to pull the people out of the pit, and they got 16 out alive. They found 2 dead, and they kept digging. And my great-grandfather was in the pit for 13 days. He could hear music and see lights while he was down there, but he was actually hallucinating. He had plenty of water because the mine had flooded. But he survived by eating. He kept his strength up by eating tallow. So the candles were made out of tallow, which is rendered beef fat. And I think that's maybe where I get my taste for chips cooked in beef fat. Anyway, that's my father's side. My grandfather left Wales in the Depression because there was no work in the pits. Went to the US where he worked in a factory, and then went back to the UK where my father was born. And my father was probably the first who didn't work in factories or anything. He was a research chemist. On my mother's side, my grandfather ran a shop, and he was known. Has anyone ever seen Open All Hours? It was a British comedy a few years ago, and my grandparents' shop was pretty much like that apparently, and my grandfather would lean on the broom all day and regale people with interesting stories while his wife did all the work. And I tell you that only for the reason that I'm here telling you stories while my wife is at home doing all the work. Anyway, but that's my parentage. So I don't come from a food background. I don't come from a farming background. My parents came out to Australia. Well, they grew up in post-war England. They met in England. And in those days, it was rationing. So they grew up with very little of the sort of food that even Australians would have had in the post-war years. And to put it in context, rationing meant, and I saw the ration book a couple of years ago, my mum showed it to me, and the only thing I can remember from it was how much butter you're allowed, a tablespoon and a half of butter or lard per person per fortnight. So that's the kind of rationing that they were having to deal with, right? They were dealing with very little, had very little. I mean, I put a tablespoon and a half on one piece of toast, so, you know. So, and it was England. So it was post-war England, post-industrial revolution, which managed to take most of the goodness out of their diet anyway. Post-World War II England, when processed food was making its real entry into the market, and the rationing was having an impact. So my mum and dad, when they got married, they moved out into. They didn't have any money, so they moved into a caravan for 2 years in Britain, which I imagine would be quite hard. It's impossible to get my mum into a caravan since, but 2 years in a caravan. And one thing that my mum's mum, in those days, my mum would have learned how to cook off her mum, but her mum was in a shop that was open all hours. So my mum didn't learn to cook off her mother. So when she left home, she had to cook for my father. And she would cook for my father, and she learned 2 things. One, that she was a terrible cook, and that nothing that she cooked she could eat. And 2, that my father loved everything she cooked, as long as it had enough salt in it, and thought she was an absolute angel. And to his dying day, he never had a palate. So she spent a couple of years trying to teach herself how to cook. They moved to Australia because they loved travelling and they were tight as. Probably growing up in post-war UK made them really tight. So they wanted to travel, but they didn't want to spend anything on it. So they moved to Australia because Dad got a job with the government in Canberra. And if you came out, they moved my mum and Dad and us children, there's 4 children, out to Australia. And if you stayed for 2 years and worked for 2 years, you didn't have to pay them back. And so that was my parents' plan, was to stay for 2 years and 1 day and then bugger off home again. But they never left. But Canberra in the 1970s, 1971 was when I arrived. And I don't know if anyone's been, none of you are old enough to remember Canberra in the 1970s maybe, but if anyone lived there, you may, if you're old enough, you might remember. But they moved from post-war England, my mum, not a great cook, but learning how to cook, to Canberra in the 1970s. And Canberra, if you had to rate it on a gastronomic scale in the 1970s, it wouldn't rate particularly highly. So my mum cooked. They didn't have a great deal of money, and they certainly didn't have. What they really didn't have is access to good ingredients. So I grew up with grey roast lamb, grey roast beef, grey carrots, grey Brussels sprouts, grey cabbage, grey mashed potato. Right, that was my upbringing. Generally, was grey food cooked by in my house and with my mother. But what my mum would do is, when she had time, when she had the opportunity, she would still be teaching herself to cook. So she would go and find cookbooks, and then on the weekend, if she could find ingredients, cook really interesting things from those books. And so for dinner parties and for weekends, she would try to cook better food. But generally, good food in my life was reserved for birthdays and Christmas, right? And not every birthday. It was only special birthdays. Because my family were careful with everything. And so what they would do, the one thing they did spend money on was cheese. They had this beautiful little Tupperware cheese box where all the smelly cheese would live in, so it wouldn't stink out everything else in the fridge. And Mum and Dad would pull this cheese out, maybe a beautiful brie or something like that. And I don't know where they found it, but there must have been a good deli in Canberra. And they'd cut a sliver out that we could taste and enjoy. And then they would put the rest back into the fridge and save it for best, like as if the Queen Mum was coming. So their attitude to food was, it's never going to be very good. If it is very good, don't, save some for best. And it wasn't this. We didn't garden. So growing up in Canberra, no topsoil, hard winters, hard summers, no rainfall, and no topsoil. So they didn't really grow anything either. But I fell in love with cooking. Hung around with my mum a fair bit, and I fell in love with cooking. At her apron strings. And I fell in love with cooking simply because I worked out very early on that if you hang around with Mum cooking, because they had very distinct gender roles. Dad did all the, he would do the bricklaying and the paving and the dry stone walls and learning how to, using drills and saws and stuff, which actually would have been quite helpful at this point in my life. But I worked out if you hung around with Dad, you had to do all that sort of labouring work. But if you hung around with Mum, you got to eat better and you got to eat more. That was the most important thing, that you got to eat more. So you got to the best bit of crackling off the roast pork. You got to steal icing from when you baked a cake. You got to steal, scrape the bowl and get all the extra icing and all that kind of thing. Fell in love with it, not just eating but cooking. Went off and became a chef. Didn't learn to cook great food, but eventually discovered that there was really good food out there, and often the times it has not only to do with the way it's cooked, but the raw ingredients you get. And so by this stage, when I went off to be an apprentice chef in Canberra, I worked at Canberra's most expensive restaurant. It was really posh, like really super posh. And it was so posh that the menu was in French. And it might seem really odd to younger people in the room, but in those days, a posh restaurant, and this was the most expensive place in Canberra, it's where you took your beloved on your wedding anniversary, or it's where you went for a really important occasion to get engaged or whatever. To be posh, it had to be French. And this one in particular had to be French because the owner was Greek and the chef was German. So I went to work there, and I've got to tell you, the food there was kind of like home. We were saving stuff for best. So sometimes it was good, but most of the time it wasn't. Most of the time it was fairly average, despite being super expensive and written in French. Excuse me. But I had by that stage started to realise there was good food and bad food, and started to explore this idea of this different idea to what I grew up with, which was that you can only have good food sometimes. I started to meet people who, generally from other cultures, not Anglo cultures, who said you can have good food more often. And I met this guy once. He was Italian, and he was saying that, you know, he had this theory from Europe. So when the English go on holidays and they get home from holidays, all their friends they want to know how the holiday was. How was the holiday? And they all ask, how was the weather, right? The Swiss go on holidays, they get home, all their friends are asking, was it clean? Was it very clean? The Italians, when they get home, everyone says, how was the food? What did you eat? Was it good? And that goes to the heart of the cultural difference. So I started to discover, mostly through Italian friends, that they had this idea that you could eat good food, not just Christmas and the occasional birthday, not just when someone had been able to buy a piece of cheese that they were going to put into the fridge to save it for best, and just on the fridges. Like fridges aren't a hospital, right? Nothing gets better in there, right? So you know when you put a piece of cheese back in the fridge, you're not saving it for best. You're saving it for the bin. We've got this drawer at the bottom of our fridge. I call it the compost drawer. Have you seen it? Has everyone got one? You put your vegetables in there and they miraculously turn into compost. It's amazing. It's a remarkable thing. Anyway, where was I going with that? Anyway, so my Italian friends were of the opinion that you could eat well, every day, which was a foreign concept to me. And not only every day, you could eat well every meal. And I love this idea, but it doesn't have to be particularly posh. It can be really humble food, but it has to be. You have to choose the ingredients carefully and maybe cook it with a bit of care. So I became a chef. I finished my training. Was in love with the idea of good food. Wasn't getting to cook much good food. Ended up working in a 5-star hotel in Canberra, which wasn't much better than the restaurant. And then, as soon as I finished my apprenticeship, I took off into the world, and I discovered that there was actually really good food. And these were restaurants where you could go and eat, and not only just get out of the washing up, not just be out for dinner and enjoying the fact that someone else is putting a plate in front of you and you don't have to vacuum the floor or wash up afterwards. But there was actually, some of the places I worked, where you'd be worried you'd get sick. There were places you could go. Where it actually gave you pleasure, that cooked food better than you possibly could have cooked home, or at least certainly different to the food you could cook at home. And I loved those restaurants, and I thought that's amazing. I wanted to work in them, and I wanted to cook that food. Ended up actually falling in love with restaurants on the wrong side, and ended up wondering whether it was possible to get paid to eat in restaurants, because I was actually enjoying the process of eating food more than the process of cooking food. I don't know why, sitting at a table like this compared to being if anyone's worked in hospitality and seen, knives coming your way or being locked in the freezer or belittled by your chef or, someone purposely burning your hand with a frying pan. We used to have this game where you dip your finger in batter, right? Just to give you an idea. To give you an idea of who chefs were. In my era, chefs now, say celebrity chef, it's great, isn't it? In my era, right, chefs were the people who didn't have the marks to get into plumbing, right? Hospitality vampires. They were either actual criminals or culinary criminals. Right? That's who chefs... obviously not the people who work here, but in other places, in my era, certainly. I don't know that these days. And we used to have this game, to give you an idea of the stuff we do. We would dip our fingers in batter and then put them in the deep fryer and see who could hold it there longest. That's the sort of people who work in kitchens, right? I'm not sure most of the time you want them cooking for you, but anyway. But then I discovered there were other restaurants where maybe they weren't doing that. Maybe they weren't, rubbing the steak down their shorts when you complained about the entree and then, deep frying it or whatever. So there were other restaurants. And I discovered these restaurants because I was interested in them, but wasn't getting to work in many of them. And so I went to eat out and I discovered, these amazing restaurants, you can eat really well. Wouldn't it be great if someone could pay me to do that? So I worked really hard at learning to write, and eventually learned to write about food, and ended up being a restaurant critic. And I did that for 10 years full-time, 5 years as the Sydney Morning Herald's chief restaurant critic, 3 years as the Age's cafe reviewer and writing guidebooks. So about 10 years eating in restaurants. But I always had this suspicion that And I would eat out 10 times a week, quite often I was eating out. But I always had this suspicion, and then I discovered the reality that actually restaurants don't necessarily have the best food. They certainly don't necessarily have the best ingredients all the time. And I discovered that by eating in people's homes who had a garden. People who had access to produce straight outside their back door. And I suddenly went, oh my God, there is food out there that... there are ingredients out there that are better than you can get in the most expensive restaurants in the nation. And that food, home cooking, tastes different. Not worse and not necessarily better than restaurant cooking, but different. And that home cooking is a thing all of its own. And that the flavour of home cooking can be really driven by the ingredient because things are cooked just once, just for you. Now, here today we've all had a similar meal, so they've had to prepare way ahead. But the great example of what home cooking does that restaurants can't do is the potato, right? So we grow some pretty good ones in Tassie. So if you take a potato and you cook it and you eat it, just boiled little new potatoes, whatever, in a bit of butter, you eat it, right? That's delicious. But if you cool that potato down and then reheat it, it doesn't taste the same, okay? The molecules, the starch molecules line up differently within the potato, and you actually digest it differently as well. But that's neither here nor there. But it doesn't taste the same. So that's the example. A restaurant never cooks a potato just for you. They can't. They're doing too many other things. They pre-cook all the potatoes. You can never get the flavour of a freshly cooked potato from a restaurant. Doesn't happen. Can't exist. But then you can find that with all sorts of things because restaurant cooking is different to home cooking. Anyway, I fell in love with this idea of ingredients, how ingredient-driven cooking could be really good, how home cooking should be simple, but if it's going to be simple, it has to have something with inherent flavour, whereas restaurants have, they've got skills and tricks to maybe dolly up stuff that is maybe lesser, but home cooks, more importantly than restaurants, probably need to get their hands on good ingredients. I wonder what made some food taste better than others, so I went off and started to grow some food myself. I had a little plot. I was living in Sydney. I had a little... it was a community garden. Where I lived, I couldn't have a garden. And I had this thing. It was in a churchyard, actually, and it was about the size of a grave. And to be honest, quite a few things died there in my stewardship. But that wasn't enough. I wanted to have chooks. I'd had chooks when I was growing up. I remember catching an egg that a chicken laid, still warm, still wet, when I was a child. When we had these chooks when I was growing up, and they weren't particularly well looked after chooks, to my shame. But I remember the flavour of that egg, and that was better than any egg that I could buy when I lived in the city. And I thought, I need to have chooks in my backyard. So couldn't do that where I was living. Wanted to move out of the city. Ended up moving to Tasmania. I had a friend there, and I was single, and I wanted to find somewhere I could maybe have a garden and have some chooks. So moved to Tasmania. Was looking at buying a little house maybe in Hobart, and then realised that I had enough money for a little farm, which is a really dumb thing to do, is to buy a farm when you're not really... but I'd always had this idea that I wanted to be a smallholder. You know you blockies, did you call them, I think? Yeah. So someone who grew food for themselves on a small patch of land. So I managed to buy a really cute little house which had enough land to have... I wanted 3 chooks, but I had enough room for 10, and I thought... it had a tiny bit of land, 5 acres essentially of usable land. It wasn't great; it was pretty rubbish actually. But and I thought, what can I put on that? So I put 3 sheep and 2 pigs, and then a milking cow, and then the 3 sheep had lambs, so we suddenly had 6, and the cow had a calf, so we suddenly had grazing pressure, and managed to ruin not ruin, but managed to overgraze and damage a piece of land very quickly through my stupidity and overambition. But I fell in love. But I was growing lots of food for the table. It's great when you sit down and you go, it's not just the parsley on the plate. It's not just it's wonderful to be able to put something on the plate that you've grown. But when you can actually look at the meal and go, hang on, I grew the potatoes. I grew the tomatoes. I got the olive oil from the person up the road. It's a really lovely thing. And when it actually, you realise that it's tasting better than stuff that you could buy most of the time, that's a real joy. So I fell in love with this idea of growing food, outgrew my little farm. By this stage, I had a partner and a child. We bought a bigger piece of land because when you've ruined one piece of land, you should be entrusted with another. So we were on this little. It was 22 acres, but only 5 acres of grass, really. And we moved to 70 acres, and that's where we are now. That's called Fat Pig Farm. And so what we do there is we've been growing food for ourselves and for guests. For ourselves for 8 years and for guests for the last 3.5, 4 years. And what we do is we grow everything for the table. So each mealtime is based on what nature gives us. So everyone, it's a set menu, set price, and everyone gets the same thing. So we just cook what nature has gifted us on any one particular day. And so my wife now runs the market garden. And I tend to look after the other 68 acres. I like to think that, I do 68 acres, but I can tell you, if you have 2 acres of market garden, we grow 70 different varieties of vegetable over the year, and we have about 30 or 40 different perennials. And as I was saying, we have no machine, we don't have a tractor. The only thing she's got is a brush cutter, and she does get some help. But I can tell you, her little 2 acres of market garden takes way more effort than the other 68 acres put together. So we fell in love with growing food, and so I was thinking about, on National Agriculture Day, I was thinking about that thing that's happened to me, is that after 11 years of growing food, I'm inordinately proud. I used to feel very irked by the fact that we had a show called Gourmet Farmer, because I didn't think of myself as a farmer, but now I feel that a third of my adult life I've spent tending different farms and growing, rearing animals and growing plants, and I think it's a privilege to be able to be called a farmer, even though a lot of you would maybe not consider us particularly great farmers. But I think I love it, and I'm proud of it because growing food is this miracle thing. It's this ultimate transformation. And sorry, I might just repeat a little bit of high school science here, but the fact that when you grow a plant, right? Plants have this amazing ability to do something that we can't. A plant, through photosynthesis, traps the sun. Well, all energy on Earth essentially comes from the sun, right? But we can't get it ourselves. A plant, though, can create its own food. Using photosynthesis, it turns carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrate. A plant makes sugars out of fucking thin air. Oh, that's pure alchemy. That's insane, right? That's like an insane thing. And so when you're farming, you're dealing with plants. Doesn't matter whether you've got animals or not. Plants, everything has. The only way animals can live, the only way we can live, and all animals can live, is if we eat something that has already lived. Whereas a plant doesn't need to do that. Okay, it's this lovely, lovely thing. So all this energy. So and farmers are involved in this process. And so when you think of soil, healthy living soil, each teaspoon of soil of living soil has more living things in a teaspoon of soil than there are humans on Earth. Okay, 8 billion living things in a teaspoon of living soil. Right. Half of them we don't even know the names of. Right. But that is such a beautiful thing. I mean, what a farmer does is they're dealing with this amazing ecosystem under the soil. They're all these plants that are creating sugar out of thin air. And you know, those 8 billion things that live in the soil, the protozoa, the fungi, the bacteria, nematodes, whatever, they're animals. Those 8 billion things can't create their own food from sunlight either. Only a plant can do that. So when you're farming, you are using plants to trap sugars, create sugars out of thin air to feed the microbes under your soil. And those microbes then give the plants what they want. This is this lovely, lovely, beautiful synergy, most of which we still are only just getting to understand. But plants don't eat dirt. Plants only get access to nutrients through the action of the microbes within the soil. It's this remarkable thing. And if any of you have grown a nitrogen-fixing crop, look at the nodules. That's not the plant. That's bacteria. Those little white nodules are, they're the bacteria trapped within the nodules of the plant, and this little symbiosis that happens. So farmers are dealing with this complex ecosystem of biology under the soil. They're dealing with this complex, all the plants within the system. If you're running livestock, or you've just got pressure from animals, like all ecosystems now have animals in them. So whether it's insects or wildlife or domesticated livestock, they're dealing with that. And then, if it's not complicated enough, add weather. Right? Man, no one can tell you what's going to happen next Tuesday. Right? Farmers are miracle workers. They're so good at producing food from thin air and making it not only something that fuels us, but hopefully something that is delicious and nutritious at the same time. So I'm really proud to be a farmer. But I'm also really saddened. And I'm really saddened because farming, as you and I understand it, the thing we've done for the last 10, 12,000 years, originated in the Middle East. We would probably call it European-style farming because that's where it's sort of disseminated from around the rest of the world, has buggered up soil. The farming that you and I understand has degraded land. Okay? We have consistently, since biblical times, the best way to define it because that's the most concrete records we've got, but has consistently turned arable land into desert. So the magic bit, right? The magic bit of the earth, the thin crust, the onion skin, sort of even thinner than that tiny little 2 centimetres, 1 centimetre, maybe a foot if you're not in Australia, of topsoil, the magic bit that does all the growing with all those living things in, we've been squandering that for 12,000 years, 10,000 years since we invented agriculture in the style that you and I recognise it. Not everywhere. Not everywhere's done that, but most places have. And you can read the Royal Commission from the 1930s into the rangelands on Western Australia. And you can, if you don't have to believe this, but you can see the record of what we have done to Australian topsoil by going to the glaciers in New Zealand and seeing the 1930s, the 1980s, and probably the 2019 layer of topsoil. When you see a dust storm, it's not dust. It's only fucking dust if it's come from a road. If dust is blowing off a paddock or your grazing land or your tilled field, that is not dust. That is topsoil. That's the magic bit. Okay? 50% of the carbon that we had in agricultural land has been lost into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. Between 1/3 and 1/4 of the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution is lost from soil. It's what we have done to soil. If you plough land, you lose topsoil 100 times faster than it can be made. Okay? If you do no-till, okay, potentially you're losing topsoil 25 times faster than it can be made. Well, not as bad as 100 times faster. They used to say, the thing about topsoil, they're not making any of it anymore. That's the expression. Now, we have done... When you see an eroded gully... I've been flying over Australia. I've seen salt pans. I've seen 3-metre high eroded gullies. I've got erosion on my property. If I see my creek running muddy, and it always runs muddy, that's not mud, that's my topsoil. If my creek is not running clear, I'm losing topsoil. That's the magic bit. Every time that blows away, washes away, every time we lose that, that's not just your asset, that's the national asset that we're losing. Okay? So I'm saddened by farming. And more so, I'm disappointed. And I'm going to tell you why I'm disappointed. I'm going to go back to my family. Those miners in my family, right, most of them died young. They died of black lung, miner's lung, okay, from breathing in coal dust. Okay, they didn't know what was happening at the time. They worked hard, they had short, hopefully pleasurable lives. My grandfather, when he went to the US, escaped the mines, managed to work with silica, died of silicosis before I was born, a lung disease. In 1968, the British Medical Journal wrote that the cause of mesothelioma is asbestos. James Hardy knew that asbestos caused mesothelioma. My father bought a block of land 2 hours from Canberra. We got a house built, clad with asbestos. My dad didn't have to cut it. Great. Someone else did. 1976, 8 years after the British Medical Journal talked about mesothelioma being caused by asbestos, right? I went with my father weekend after weekend. It was just a lock-up stage. We did the inside. I remember going to the house, walked in, and it was like, the stud walls are just there and you could see right through them. We eventually clad all those walls with plywood. And then my father and I, and mostly my father, then cut the hardy plank and all the asbestos sheets for the wet areas of that house, the shack that we lived in. Now, 99% of medical experts, the scientists in the field, knew in the 1960s that asbestos gives you mesothelioma. Okay? 99% of the experts said asbestos will give you mesothelioma. 2015, my dad drowned in the fluid in his lungs from mesothelioma. Right? Why is that relevant? 99% of scientists say climate change is caused by human action. And farmers are fucking silent on this. People trust farmers. I have spoken to farmers everywhere, all around the country, and they will tell me, oh my God, it's not like it used to be, but humans have nothing to do with it, right? Humans have nothing to do with it. 99% of climate scientists, the people, man, if my great-great-great-great-grandfather was told, put on a dust mask so you don't die of black lung, because 99% of scientists are told you should put on a mask, they'd have fucking put it on, right? Wouldn't they? They're the experts in the field. The only thing they can work out that is driving the change in the climate, the only thing they can work out, it's not sunspots or magnetic fields. The people who are experts in this field, and they're not doing it, they're not just making this stuff up. The only thing they can find is that it's probably human caused. And I'm disappointed in farmers, right? I'm proud to call myself a farmer and work with the people who actually grow the food to feed this nation, the 1% of the population who grow the food for the 99%. But I'm saddened and disappointed. But I'm also hopeful, really hopeful, because they are still making topsoil. Okay? And if we can release 25 to 33% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere today has come from our topsoil, farmers have the opportunity to draw that carbon back out of the atmosphere and store it in soil. Now, where I live, right, climate change ain't an issue. I tell you why. My neighbour is the gourmet farmer, winemaker of the... gourmet traveller, winemaker of the year. Gourmet farmer. Gourmet traveller, winemaker of the year, right? His professional life's gone for 20 years, but he's got records going back 50, 60 years from when they pick grapes. Grapes, probably the single most valuable commodity crop in Australia, especially in southern Tasmania. They know they're picking grapes on average half to 1 day earlier per year, right? This crop is worth so much. Winemakers believe in climate change. That crop is worth so much, and they have such detailed record keeping that they know this is happening. Now, for the rest of us, you can say humans didn't cause it, right? Fine. You can believe that. You can ignore the advice of the 99.9% of scientists in the field who think that humans have had an impact, right? You ignore that. But don't ignore this, okay? That carbon in your soil will make your soil better. I was reading this morning about if you can increase your soil carbon by 1 or 2%, the humus, the carbon-rich matter in your soil, you can store up to 16 litres of water extra per cubic metre. There is so much. If anybody has a farm If anyone deals with farmers, there is so much evidence about how good storing carbon in your soil is good for you as farmers. Okay? The first person in the world to be paid to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in soil was a beef farmer. And beef, we all know, is on the nose with certain environmental groups because of the methane emissions. The only person in the world who's ever been paid by the government to store carbon in soil was a beef farmer out of Gippsland in Australia. He's increased his soil carbon from 3% to 10% in the space of 5 years. If you can increase I think the average in Australia, we've decreased the carbon in our soil it's really hard in Australia because it's such a varied landscape, from 3 or 4% down to less than 1% on average carbon in our soils today. We've buggered up the land that is entrusted to us because we only look after it for our lifetime, but then it passes to someone else. It may be our family, it may be someone else. But we might own this land, but we really are here for a speck in geological time. If you can increase your soil carbon from 1 to 4%, you can at least double the water holding capacity of your soil. Man, what are you going through at the moment? Drought. What are you going through at the moment? Bushfires. You know, if you want to increase the fertility of your soil, if you want to have social license, then you need to look at how you can look after the health of your soil, the billions of microbes that should be in living soil but maybe aren't. And I recommend to all of you to whether you believe in man-made climate change or not, it doesn't really matter. Look up quorum sensing, look up carbon sequestration in soil. There is so much good information. There are so many great farmers who are doing so many good things, who are actually growing topsoil. There's places in the world where you've got the forest. As soon as you cut down a forest, you tend to lose carbon. But right next to where they've cut down the forest, they've changed their farming practices. They don't have tilling. They never have bare earth. They plant multi-species rotations if they're cropping, and they generally put livestock across. And they've got more carbon in the farming area than they've got in the forest next door. They've actually increased the amount of carbon stored in the soil through their farming practices as opposed to degrading the land. And that's what makes me hopeful. That's what makes me... I'm proud, saddened, disappointed, but I am ultimately hopeful that farmers won't continue to bugger up the soil that we are entrusted with, that we won't bugger up the land that we're gifted. The 99% of population who ask us to grow food for them want us to do that on their behalf. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Rural Press Club of Queensland's Lunch Series podcast. To book a ticket to our next event, visit our website at ruralpressclub.com.au. Music supplied by audionautics.com.